On the morning of January 11th, 1944, a young German fighter pilot climbed his Messerschmitt into a cold blue sky above central Germany. He had done this many times before. He knew exactly how the day would go. The American bombers would come. Their little escort fighters would run out of fuel and turn back, and then he and his squadron would move in and kill them the way they had killed them for 2 years. He was wrong about all of it, because that morning, for the first time in the war, the American fighters did not turn back. They kept coming all the way to the target, all the way to Berlin if they had to, and one of them, a single Mustang with 2 Chinese words painted on its side, would do something no one in the sky had ever seen a fighter pilot do before. This is the story of the day the German pilots looked up and understood they had lost the war. The sky over Schweinfurt had turned black on the afternoon of October 14, 1943. Not from clouds, from burning bombers. 291 DIN 4 fortresses had crossed the German border that morning. 60 of them would never come home. Another 142 would return with holes punched through their skin, engines dead, crews wounded or missing. In a single afternoon, the United States 8th Air Force had lost the equivalent of an entire combat wing. The men called it Black Thursday. At his headquarters at Pine Tree, outside London, Lieutenant General Ira Eaker read the loss reports and understood something terrible. His entire theory of war was breaking apart in front of him. For 2 years, the Americans had believed something the British had already stopped believing. They believed a heavily armed bomber flown in tight formation could defend itself, that formations of B-17s bristling with 50 caliber machine guns could punch through enemy fighter defenses in broad daylight, hit precision targets, and return home. Schweinfurt proved they could not. The math was brutal. At a 10% loss rate per mission, the statistical chance of a bomber crew surviving 25 missions was almost zero. Air crews knew this. They flew the missions anyway, but they knew Eaker had run out of answers. The bombers needed fighter escort all the way to their targets, but no American fighter had that kind of range. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a magnificent aircraft, brutal and fast, but even with drop tanks, it could barely reach the German border before its fuel gauges began to bite. The P-38 Lightning had more range, but there were too few of them, and most were fighting in the Mediterranean and the Pacific. Beyond the fighters' turn-back point, the bombers flew naked. That was where the Luftwaffe hunted them. On January 6, 1944, a small aircraft touched down at Bushy Hall, west of London. From it stepped a compact, sharp-eyed man, Jimmy Doolittle, racing pilot, aeronautical engineer, doctor of science from MIT, and the man who on 18th, 1942, had led 16 B-25s Mitchells off the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet and bombed Tokyo. He was here to replace Eaker. The change of command was announced quietly. Eaker was being sent to the Mediterranean. Doolittle was taking over the 8th Air Force. Officially, it was a reorganization. Unofficially, it was a message. The old theory had failed. Someone new was going to try something different. Doolittle had 5 days before the next major mission. He was going to need every one of them. 4 years earlier, and half a world away, in the spring of 1940, a British purchasing commission had walked into a hangar in Inglewood, California, and asked North American Aviation for something impossible. They wanted fighters, right now, hundreds of them. The Battle of Britain was coming, and the Royal Air Force needed every aircraft it could get. The commission asked North American to build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license. James Kindleberger, the company's president, said no. Instead, he offered to design something better from scratch. In 120 days, the British agreed. They had no choice. 102 days later, an unpainted airframe rolled out of the North American factory. It had a razor-thin fuselage, a laminar flow wing that had never been mass-produced before, and a radiator scoop mounted under the belly that engineers said would fail. It was called the NA-73X. On October 26, 1940, it flew. The British called it a Mustang. For the first 2 years of its life, almost nobody in America wanted it. The problem was the engine. The Mustang carried an Allison V710, a 12-cylinder inline that made good power at low altitude and lost it catastrophically above 15,000 feet. The United States Army Air Forces looked at the aircraft, saw a beautiful airframe married to the wrong power plant, and shrugged. They ordered a small batch for ground attack and reconnaissance. They gave it a lukewarm designation. They moved on. The Mustang, in the winter of 1942, was on its way to becoming a footnote. Then, on April 30th, 1942, a Royal Air Force test pilot named Ronald Harker climbed into the cockpit of a Mustang Mark I at RAF Duxford. Harker flew fighters for a living. He tested them for Rolls-Royce. And what he wrote in his report, after that single flight, would change the outcome of the air war over Europe. The airframe, he said, was superb. The visibility was excellent. The handling was among the finest he had ever encountered. But the engine was strangling everything the airframe could do. "Give this aircraft the Merlin," Harker wrote, "and you will have the finest fighter in the world." The Merlin, the same engine that powered the Spitfire, the same two-stage supercharged high-altitude power plant that had won the Battle of Britain. Within months, the marriage was performed. A Packard-built Merlin was mated to a Mustang airframe. The prototype flew in November 1942. The performance numbers came back and stopped conversations in rooms full of engineers. 20,000 feet in 5.9 minutes, 440 miles per hour at altitude. Range with drop tanks that could reach anywhere in Germany and come home again. The aircraft that had almost been abandoned was suddenly the most important fighter in the American arsenal. Production of the new variant, the P-51B, began at Inglewood in June 1943. By November, the first squadrons were forming up in England. They just needed pilots. In a city called Canton, on the southern coast of China, a boy had been born on April 8, 1913. His father was an American ophthalmologist, teaching eye surgery at Canton Christian College. His mother spoke Chinese fluently. The boy grew up between two worlds. He learned Mandarin as a child. He watched Chinese soldiers march past the family home during the warlord conflicts of the 1920s. He came of age understanding what most American boys did not. That war had a face, that empires could crumble, that distance from the fighting did not mean safety. His name was James Harold Howard. He came to the United States for high school. He attended Pomona College in California. He joined the United States Navy and earned his wings at Pensacola. By 1941, he was a Navy fighter pilot, flying off the wooden deck of the aircraft carrier Enterprise. Then, in the spring of that year, an offer arrived. A retired Army captain named Claire Chennault was recruiting American pilots for secret mission. They would fly for the Republic of China. They would fight the Japanese. They would fly a fighter called the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. The pay was good. The odds were not. The name of the unit had not yet been made public. The world would come to know them as the Flying Tigers. Howard resigned his Navy commission and boarded a ship for the Far East. 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, he was flying combat over Burma. In the sky above the country of his birth, James Howard shot down 6 Japanese aircraft. He learned that a fighter pilot's most important weapon was not his guns. It was his patience. He learned to see the enemy before the enemy saw him. He learned to fire in short, tight bursts and break away before the counterattack came. He also learned to speak of it very little. When the Flying Tigers were disbanded on July 4, 1942, Howard came home. He accepted a commission as a captain in the Army Air Forces. He was promoted to major, and in the summer of 1943, he was given command of the 356th Fighter Squadron, part of a brand new unit forming up in the American Midwest. Its name was the 354th Fighter Group. Its commanding officer was a colonel named Kenneth Martin, and in November 1943, when the 354th arrived at their new base at Boxted in southeastern England, they were told what they would be flying. They would be the first American unit in combat with the P-51B Mustang. But there was something the 354th did not know. Something that, in the confusion of a rapidly expanding air war, almost nobody was talking about. They did not belong to the 8th Air Force. The 8th was strategic. It flew the heavy bombers, the 4-engined Leviathans that struck deep into Germany. The 8th needed long-range escort fighters more than any other unit in the American military. The 8th had been begging for Mustangs for months. The 354th Fighter Group belonged to the 9th Air Force. The 9th was tactical. Its mission was ground support, close air support for the invasion of Europe that everyone knew was coming. It flew fighter bombers and medium bombers. It supported infantry. It was not, by any doctrine of the American Air Arm, supposed to be escorting B-17s over central Germany. But the 9th had the Mustangs, and the 8th did not. So, an agreement was quietly reached. The 354th would remain under 9th Air Force its mission sheet, on paper, but operationally, in the air, for the missions that mattered, they would answer to 8th Fighter Command. They would fly bomber escort until the 8th got its Mustang groups, which everyone assumed would be within weeks. The first American unit to take the P-51B Mustang into combat over Europe was, in a sense, the wrong unit, from the wrong Air Force. On loan for a mission it had never been designed for. That was the situation in the first week of January 1944. Doolittle was in command. Howard was leading a squadron. The 354th was flying its first shakedown missions over France and the German coast, and on the far side of the channel, radar operators of the German Luftwaffe were beginning to notice something. A new escort fighter was reaching farther into occupied Europe than any American aircraft had ever reached before. They did not yet know what it was. They did not yet know it could reach them. But in 5 days, on the morning of January 11th, 1944, 663 bombers would rise into the English dawn, and the men on both sides of the coming battle would learn, together, what the arrival of the Mustang truly meant. The alarm clocks went off in the dark, across the flat farmland of East Anglia, in Nissen huts scattered around more than 40 airfields. Young men opened their eyes to the same ceiling they had opened them to the day before. Corrugated iron, a single bare bulb, the smell of damp wool and coal smoke and shaving cream. It was 4 o'clock in the morning, on Tuesday, January 11th, 1944. The mission briefings began at 5 o'clock. In the officers' mess at Dienethorpe, home of the 401st Bombardment Group, the pilots and navigators and bombardiers filed in with tin cups of coffee and sat on wooden benches, a curtain covered in their map at the front of the room. Everyone knew what that curtain meant. When it came down, some of them would find out they were going to die that day. The curtain came down. The red yarn on the map ran east from England, across the North Sea, over the Dutch coast, and deep into central Germany, deeper than most of them had ever flown. The tape ended at 3 cities: Oschersleben, Halberstadt, Braunschweig, 100 miles southwest of Berlin. At the front of the room, the intelligence officer explained what waited for them. The AGO Flugzeugwerke at Oschersleben was the largest producer for Focke-Wulf 190 fighters remaining in the Reich after the Marienburg plant had been destroyed. The Junkers factory at Halberstadt was making wings for U-88 bombers. The Wagam works near Braunschweig were building Messerschmitt 110 heavy fighters, the twin-engine killers that carried rockets under their wings and fired them into the bomber formations from beyond machine gun range. The men in that room understood the equation immediately. They were being sent to destroy the very aircraft that would rise up to kill them. At Boxted, 40 miles to the east, the pilots of the 354th Fighter Group were getting the same briefing at the same hour. Their target was different. Their job was to keep the bombers alive. Major James Howard sat in the second row and listened. He was 30 years old. He had a narrow face, dark hair cut short, and the quiet manner of a man who had already survived one war and did not feel the need to talk about it. The other pilots in the room called him Major. A few of the older ones, the ones who had been with him since the group formed up in the American Midwest, sometimes forgot and called him Sir. At the front of the room stood Colonel Kenneth Martin, 33 years old, group commander, a career fighter pilot who had waited most of his adult life for this moment. Martin explained the plan. 663 heavy bombers would take off in 3 divisions. The 1st Bombardment Division would strike Oschersleben. The 3rd would hit Halberstadt. The 2nd would go to Braunschweig. P-47 Thunderbolts would escort them across the North Sea and as far into Germany as their fuel allowed. Then the Thunderbolts would turn back. At that moment, at the deepest point of the mission, 49 P-51B Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group would meet the bombers over the target. They were the only long-range escort in the entire European theater. 49 fighters, 663 bombers. The rest of the German sky belonged to the Luftwaffe. Martin ended the briefing with something close to a smile. Any questions? There were none. Takeoff began at 7:30 in the morning. If you have ever stood on a runway in the English winter, you know the feeling. The mist rolls low across the grass. The taxiways glisten with frost. The engines of a 4-engine bomber, spinning up in the cold, sound like something ancient and enormous being wakened against its will. Now, imagine 663 of them. They rose from more than 40 fields across East Anglia, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, silver and olive drab forming up in the pale winter sky, wingtip to wingtip, climbing to 20,000 feet in slow, patient spirals. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the formation was crossing the Dutch coast. That was when the weather began to fail. The forecast had promised broken cloud over Germany. The reality was solid overcast, climbing higher than the bombers could fly, streaming in from the northwest in unbroken layers. The lead navigators radioed back to command. The escort fighters were losing sight of their charges. The bomb groups were losing sight of each other. At Pine Tree, on the outskirts of London, the operations staff of the 8th Air Force made a decision. Recall. The order went out over the wireless. The 2nd Bombardment Division headed for Braunschweig, turned around and began the long flight home. The The 3rd Bombardment Division, headed for Halberstadt, did the same. The 1st Bombardment Division did not. At the head of the 1st flew a B-17, carrying a 39-year-old brigadier general named Robert F. Travis. Travis was a tall, hard-jawed Georgian, a West Point graduate, and one of the youngest general officers in the American Air Arm. He had commanded combat units in North Africa and England. He was known as a man who led from the front. Today, he was leading from the front of the deepest penetration mission the 8th Air Force had ever attempted. The recall order reached his radio operator. Travis read it. He looked out through the cockpit windows at the Tu-38 bombers strung out behind him in the winter sky. He calculated the distance to the target. He calculated the distance back to England. He weighed the risk of turning a massive formation around inside German airspace, breaking up the defensive box, exposing every bomber to the Luftwaffe individually. Then he made his decision. He would press on. Historians have argued about that decision for 80 years. Some have called it courageous. Others have called it reckless. What is certain is this. When Robert Travis chose to continue toward Oschersleben on the morning of January 11, 1944, 238 American heavy bombers stayed with him, and 60 of them were not going to come home. Below them, on the frozen airfields of northern Germany, the Luftwaffe was climbing to meet them. From bases at Dielen and Rheine and Wunstorf and Jever, the fighter groups of the German air defense were scrambling. Jagdgeschwader 1, Jagdgeschwader 3, Jagdgeschwader 11, Zerstörergeschwader 26, the Messerschmitt Bf-109G, the Focke-Wulf 190A, and the Bf-110 twin-engine heavy fighter, ungainly and slow, but armed with something the American bomber crews had learned to fear: rockets. The Wurfgranat 21, a 21-centimeter mortar shell mounted in a tube slung under each wing, fired from beyond the range of the bomber's .50 caliber machine guns. One rocket, well placed, could break a B-17 in half. The German plan had not changed in months. Wait for the escort fighters to turn back. Then move in. Fire the rockets from long range. Watch the American formation disintegrate. Send the single-engine fighters in through the wreckage to finish the survivors. It had worked at Regensburg. It had worked at Schweinfurt. It had worked again and again through the terrible autumn of 1943. There was no reason to believe it would not work today. At exactly the moment the German fighters expected, the American P-47 Thunderbolts began to turn for home. They had reached the limit of their fuel. They banked, one by one, and dove away toward the west, leaving the bomber formation naked. The Bf-110s of Zerstörergeschwader 26 leveled off 10,000 feet above the bombers, opened their rocket tubes, and prepared to fire. That was when the escort arrived. 49 Mustangs dropping down through the overcast, cutting straight through the German attack formation, before the German pilots even understood what they were seeing. Colonel Kenneth Martin led the 354th into the fight. He picked out a Bf-110, closed on it from behind, and opened fire. The German pilot broke hard. Martin followed. The engagement was over the town of Halberstadt at 25,000 feet. What happened next has never been entirely resolved. American witnesses reported that Martin's Mustang closed too fast, that he was unable to break off in time, that his aircraft and the Bf-110 collided in mid-air, disintegrating together in a fireball that spread across a mile of sky. Some accounts have suggested it was deliberate, that Martin, seeing that his target would escape, chose to ram it rather than let it live to attack the bombers. There is no way to know. Martin survived. He bailed out at high altitude, drifted down through the freezing German air, and was captured within hours by local police. He would spend the next 16 months as a prisoner of war at Stalag Luft 3 on the Baltic coast at Bath. The first American unit to take the P-51 Mustang into major combat over Germany had just lost its commanding officer. Nobody in the American formation knew it yet. The battle spread across 100 miles of sky. Individual Mustangs, separated from their leaders in the confusion, hunted individual German fighters. Some dove after Bf-109s, trying to escape at low altitude, and discovered for the first time in the war that an American fighter could catch them. Others climbed after Focke-Wulfs, and outturned them in the thin air above 30,000 feet. For the German pilots, something was happening that had never happened before. They tried to disengage. They rolled. They dran. They broke away in the sharp, sudden climbs that had led them to escape from P-47s and P-38s for 2 years. The Mustangs came with them, an Oberleutnant of Jagdgeschwader 11, one of the pilots climbing to attack the bombers that morning, later wrote that his squadron had been briefed to expect the usual American escorts. He said his flight had made its intercept run, confident that the fighters overhead were the shorter-range Thunderbolts. When the first Mustang closed on his wingman and stayed with him through a full splits at high speed, he understood immediately that everything the Luftwaffe had believed about the range of American fighters was wrong. He was one of the ones who lived to write about it. Many did not. In the middle of all of this, a single Mustang lost its group. James Howard had made his first pass on a Bf-110, climbing toward the bombers. He closed 200 yards, fired a short burst, and watched the German aircraft roll onto its back and fall away, trailing black smoke. His first victory of the day. Then he pulled up hard, looking for his wingman. They were gone. In the swirling chaos of the dogfight, Howard had climbed above his squadron. Below him, he could see contrails, tracer fire, aircraft turning in tight circles, but he could no longer identify friend from enemy. The radio was a wall of overlapping voices. His fuel gauge was already reading below half. He looked down. 20,000 feet below him, in a long gleaming line night, the B-17s of 1st Bombardment Division were still driving east toward Oschersleben. He looked closer. Coming in from the north in loose finger fours were German fighters. Not 2 or 3, not 5 or 6. He counted and stopped counting. 30 or more. There were no other American fighters in the sky. Howard understood in that moment what was about to happen to those bombers. He pushed his stick forward and dove. The B-17 he came down on was flying with the 401st Bombardment Group. Its pilot was named Allison Brooks. He was leading the mission for the 401st that morning. A tail gunner in one of his ships saw the Mustang appear out of the sun and screamed a warning over the intercom. Then the gunner realized what he was looking at. A single P-51 Mustang dropping down into the cloud of German fighters. Not turning away, not calling for help, attacking. Howard picked out a Focke-Wulf 190 that was setting up a run on the lead bomber. He closed to firing range and squeezed the trigger. 2 of his 4 machine guns fired. The others did not. He did not know it yet, but he had just encountered the great flaw of the early Mustang. The 4.50 caliber guns in the P-51B's wings were mounted at an angle to fit the thin airfoil. Under the stress of a high-G maneuver, the ammunition belts twisted in their feed chutes. The guns jammed. 2 of Howard's 4 guns were already out of the fight. He kept firing anyway. The Focke-Wulf broke off. Howard turned inside another one and fired again. This time 3 guns worked. He hit the German fighter in the engine. Smoke poured out. The pilot bailed. 2 victories. Howard pulled up and looked around. The bombers were still under attack. New German fighters were coming in from every direction. His guns were failing one by one. For the next 30 minutes, James Howard did the only thing he could think of. He kept flying at them. He would climb, pick a target, dive on it, fire whatever guns still worked, and pull off. When he had no guns, he still made the pass. The German pilots saw an American fighter coming at them, and they broke away. They did not know his guns were empty. They only knew that if they did not evade, they might die. For 30 minutes on the morning of January 11, 1944, one man kept the Luftwaffe off American bombers by making attack after attack after attack. Some of the passes had bullets in them, some did not. None of the German pilots knew which. Inside the B-17s of the 401st Bombardment Group, gunners and bombardiers and navigators watched through their scarred plexiglass. They saw the single Mustang alone, against everything turning tightly through the German formation. They saw it climb, dive, fire, and climb again. They did not know his name. They could not reach him on the radio. They could see painted on the side of his aircraft 2 words in bright yellow. Ding Hao. It was a phrase Howard had picked up in China. It meant rough, roughly, very good. It was written in the language of the country where he had been born. Below them, the target was coming into view. The AGO Flugzeugwerk at Oschersleben, the factory that was building the very fighters attacking them, spread out under a thin layer of winter haze. The bombardiers hunched over their Norden bomb sites. The bomb bay doors ground open. The bombs fell. The formation turned for home. James Howard turned with them. His fuel gauge was reading close to empty. His guns were almost entirely jammed. His aircraft had been hit. He did not know it, but somewhere over Halberstadt, his group commander was drifting down under a parachute into German captivity. He knew only that he had to keep the bombers alive as long as he could. He flew alongside them on the north flank of the formation, all the way to the Dutch coast. By the time the last Bf-109 broke off pursuit, James Howard had been in continuous combat for nearly 40 minutes. He had made, by the count of the bomber crews who watched him, at least 6 attack runs. He had fired the last of his ammunition somewhere over the German border. He had, on his own, protected a group of B-17s that had every reason to expect they would not survive the day. 60 American heavy bombers did not come home from the raid of January 11, 1944. The 401st Bombardment Group lost 4. Without the man in the Mustang, they would have lost many more. None of them, as their damaged aircraft touched down on the runways of Deenathorpe that afternoon, knew his name. But their commander, Colonel Harold Bowman, wanted to. And by the following week, so would the entire United States of America. The Mustang came in low over the Essex countryside just before 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Its cowling was blackened. Its skin was streaked with oil and cordite. Along the port wing, 3 neat holes marked where a Focke-Wulf's cannon shells had passed through without finding anything vital. James Howard set the aircraft down on the runway at Boxted and let it roll. When the ground crew climbed onto the wing and looked in at him, they saw a man who looked tired. Nothing more. He unbuckled his harness, climbed out, and walked toward the debriefing hut with the steady, unhurried stride he had used every other day of the war. The intelligence officer asked him what had happened. Howard thought about it. He said he had gotten separated from his group. He said he had found a bomber formation under attack and had done what he could. He said he thought he had shot down 2 German fighters, possibly 3. He was not sure. He asked whether the bombers had made it home. The intelligence officer did not know yet. Howard nodded, signed the report, and went to find something to eat. 40 miles to the north, at Deenathorpe, the surviving B-17s of the 401st Bombardment Group were coming home one by one. The runway lights were on before the last of them landed. Ambulances waited at the hardstands. Ground crews stood in the cold counting aircraft as they came in, subtracting each returning bomber from the number that had left in the morning. When the arithmetic was finished, 4 B-17s were missing. It should have been many more. Inside the operations building, the pilots were being debriefed. And again, the same story came out. There had been a Mustang, one Mustang. It had appeared out of the clouds when the German fighters came in. It had stayed with them all the way through the target run. It had fought off attack after attack alone for more than half an hour. When it finally broke off and turned for home, the German fighters had broken off with it. Nobody knew whose it was. Nobody had seen the pilot's face, but every man in that room remembered 2 things: a yellow marking on the side of the aircraft and 2 Chinese words painted below the cockpit. Colonel Harold Bowman, commanding the 401st Bombardment Group, listened to the reports. He had lost 4 crews that afternoon, 40 men, fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. Now, his pilots were telling him that most of the men who had come home had kept alive by a single fighter pilot whose name nobody knew. Bowman picked up the telephone. He called every fighter group within escort range of Oschersleben. He asked the same question at each base. Do you have a pilot who was over Oschersleben this morning alone in a Mustang with Chinese writing on it? At Boxted, the answer came back, yes. Major James Howard, 356th Fighter Squadron, 354th Fighter Group. The following Monday morning, and a young reporter for the New York Times, named Frederick Graham, arrived at Boxted with a photograph. Graham was one of a small group of American war correspondents, attached to the 8th Air Force. He had covered aircrew stories before. He had heard, filtered through the sensors, the outline of what had happened on the mission of January 11th. He had come to see the man who did it. Howard did not want to be seen. He agreed to the interview because his commanding officer told him to. He sat on the edge of a folding chair in a Nissen hut. He answered questions in short, even sentences. When Graham asked him how many German aircraft he had shot down, Howard said he was not sure. When Graham asked him what he had been thinking as he attacked 30 enemy fighters alone, Howard said he had seen a job that needed doing. Graham asked whether he had been afraid. Howard said he had been busy. The story ran in the New York Times on January 19, 1944. The headline read, "One-man Air Force bullet tells his feet." The next morning, James Howard was famous. Newspapers across America ran his photograph. Radio broadcasts described the fight in language that was probably too dramatic. Andy Rooney, then a young reporter for Stars and Stripes, called it the greatest fighter pilot story of the war. Letters began to arrive at Boxted from parents of B-17 crewmen thanking him for their sons' lives. Howard read a few of them. He did not know how to answer them. He wrote back to some anyway. 5 months later, in June 1944, on the eve of the invasion of Europe, General Karl Spaatz pinned the Medal of Honor onto the tunic of James Howell Howard on a windswept airfield in England. Howard was the only fighter pilot in the entire European theaters of operations to receive the medal and live. The only other airman awarded the Medal of Honor for aerial combat over Europe was Lieutenant Colonel Leon Vance of the 489th Bombardment Group. who had received it for keeping a shot-up B-24 in the air over Normandy on June 5, 1944. Vance died on his way home to the United States in a transport aircraft that disappeared over the North Atlantic 7 weeks later. 2 men, 1 survived. The citation for Howard's medal did not come from his own report. He had barely written one. It came from the crews of the 401st Bombardment Group, bomber pilots, bombardiers, radio operators, waist gunners, men who had watched from their windows and turrets as a single American fighter kept them alive. Their words were what General Spaatz read that morning. Their gratitude was what the medal was made of. By the time Howard received it, everything about the air war over Europe had changed. At the end of January 1944, Jimmy Doolittle had walked into his headquarters at High Wycombe and given an order that broke 60 years of military doctrine. American fighters would no longer be tied to the bombers. They would be released ahead of the bomber stream to hunt. Bomber crews complained. They wanted their little friends close where they could see them. Doolittle did not care. He had studied the mathematics of Schweinfurt. He had studied what had happened on January 11th. He understood that as long as the American fighters were flying defense, the Luftwaffe would choose when and where to fight. As long as the Luftwaffe could choose, the Luftwaffe could survive. He was going to take that choice away. Between February 20 and February 25, 1944, the 8th Air Force flew what history remembers as Big Week. 6 days of sustained assault on the German aircraft industry. Every heavy bomber in England, every fighter that could fly, weather that was for once on the American side. The Luftwaffe rose to defend the Reich as it had to. The P-51s were waiting. On March 4, 1944, the first American fighters reached the sky over Berlin. On March 6, the first major American raid on the capital of the Third Reich saw 69 bombers lost and 80 German fighters shot down. The Luftwaffe kept fighting. It kept dying. By the summer of 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter groups in the 8th Air Force were flying Mustangs. The one that was not was the 56th Fighter Group, which held on to its P-47 Thunderbolts out of pride, and by the end of the war had the highest kill total of any American fighter group in Europe. But they were the exception. The rule after January 11, 1944 was the Mustang, and the rule was killing the Luftwaffe. The numbers tell the story were more clearly than any narrator can. In 1943, the Luftwaffe lost roughly 2,400 aircraft on the Western Front. In 1944, that number rose to more than 6,000. In 1943, a new German fighter pilot arriving at his squadron had received between 250 and 300 hours of flight training. By the end of 1944, that number had fallen below 100 hours. An American replacement pilot, in 1944, arrived with more than 400 hours in his logbook. That was the equation Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's general of the fighter arm, understood better than anyone. In his memoirs, written after the war, while Galland was blunt about what had happened, the appearance of long-range American escort fighters, he wrote, was the decisive factor in the defeat of the Luftwaffe, not the bombing itself. The bombing hurt, but the German aircraft industry, dispersed into forests and rail tunnels and small workshops, actually reached its highest monthly production figures in September 1944, when it built more than 3,300 fighters in a single month. The Germans were not running out of aircraft. They were running out of men who could fly them. The men who could fly them had been killed in the sky over their own country by escort fighters that did not turn back. James Howard did not stay in combat much longer. On January 30th, 1944, less than 3 weeks after Oschersleben, he shot down another Bf-110 in a fight over Brunswick. On April 8, 1944, he shot down a Focke-Wulf 190 over the same city. It was his 6th aerial victory of the European War, his 12th of the entire conflict, counting the 6 he had scored in China with the Flying Tigers. Shortly afterward, he was rotated home to help train new fighter pilots at bases in the American Southeast. The war went on without him. His squadron mates flew escort over Normandy on D-Day. They flew over the Ardennes during the German counteroffensive in December. They flew over Berlin in the last weeks of the war, and they came home in the spring of 1945 to a country that had almost forgotten why they had gone. Colonel Kenneth Martin, the group commander, who had rammed his Mustang into a Bf-110 over Halberstadt on the morning of January 11th, spent 16 months as a prisoner of war at Stalag Luft. He was liberated by Soviet forces in May 1945. He came home, resumed his career, and eventually retired as a colonel. He rarely spoke about the war. Brigadier General Robert Travis, The man who had chosen to continue the mission into Germany after the recall order went on to command combat wings in the Pacific. He was promoted to Major General after the war. On August 5, 1950, he was killed in the crash of a B-29 Superfortress at Fairfield Suisun Air Force Base in California. The base was renamed in his honor. To this day, it is called Travis Air Force Base. Adolf Galland survived the war, wrote his memoirs, and became one of the most respected voices in post-war aviation history. He died in Remagen, Germany, in 1996. The men Howard fought that morning, the pilots of Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 11 and Zerstörer 26, mostly did not survive. The ones who did rarely spoke of it. The ones who wrote memoirs, as some of them did, described the arrival of the long-range American fighter in nearly identical terms. They had understood on that day that the war was going to be lost, not that day, not that week, not that month, but eventually, and that from that morning forward, there was no longer any patch of German sky where a Luftwaffe pilot could rest. James Howard came home to the United States. He married. He had children. He went into business in St. Louis, and then in Florida. He served as the director of a small airport near St. Petersburg. In 1991, he published a memoir. He called it Roar of the Tiger. It is a quiet book written by a man who had never quite understood why so many people wanted to know his story. He died in Bay Pines, Florida on March 18, 1995. He was 81 years old. His Mustang, the P-51B, with serial number 43631, the aircraft the world knew as Ding Hao, did not survive the war. After Howard rotated home, the aircraft was flown by other pilots of the 354th Fighter Group. It was eventually damaged beyond economic repair and scrapped for parts. Not one of Howard's original combat aircraft is known to exist today. The story survived. The airplane did not. 80 years have passed since the morning of January 11, 1944. The airfield at Boxted has become farmland. The airfield at Dienerthorpe has become farmland. The town of Oschersleben, once the center of Focke-Wulf production for the Third Reich, is now a quiet market town in the German state of Saxony-Anhalt. Old men who were boys when the bombers came still remember the day the sky filled with contrails and the smoke rose from the factory beside the railway. Somewhere in the archives of the United States Air Force is a report written in the flat, careful language of a debriefing officer describing the actions of Major James Howell Howard on the morning of January 11, 1944. The document runs a few pages. It does not use the word hero. Howard would not have permitted it, but the men whose lives he saved that morning are the reason we remember him. They were the ones who told the story. They were the ones who, in the debriefing huts at Dienerthorpe that afternoon, described a single Mustang appearing out of the clouds when they had no reason to expect help. They were the ones who, in the years that followed, wrote letters and gave interviews and stood at podiums and said quietly that they were alive because of a man they had never met. That is what the medal was made of. That is what the story is made of. And that is what the sky over central Germany on the morning of January 11, 1944, gave to the young men in the bombers, and the young men in the fighters, and the young men who came after them. A moment when the balance shifted. A moment when the range of an American fighter, and the courage of a single American pilot, and the desperate arithmetic of a war that had gone on too long, all came together in the winter sky above a factory town no one had ever heard of. The Luftwaffe would keep fighting for 16 more months, but the men who flew that day understood what had happened. The hunters had become the hunted, and the American bombers, for the first time in the long, terrible history of the Daylight Air War, had a friend who could go all the way with them, all the way to the target, all the way home.